Late Friday, Dad announced, "We'll be using your house for 3 days. It's perfect for our beach trip." I replied, "I just had spinal surgery. Please come next week." Mom answered, "The plans aren't changing." Saturday morning, they arrived with their luggage. Someone was already waiting. Dad, Mom, sister, their faces went white. 3 days post-surgery, I was still learning how to breathe around the brace. Every movement pulled at the incision along my spine, and the painkillers made the ceiling swim if I turned my head too fast. That was the state my father called me in. "We'll be using your house for 3 days," he said, like he was reading me a weather report. "It's perfect for our beach trip." I told him the truth because the truth was all I had the energy for. "I just had spinal surgery. Please come next week." There was a pause, then my mother's voice further from the phone but somehow louder. "The plans aren't changing." That sentence was familiar. I'd heard some version of it my whole life, whenever what I needed collided with what they wanted. Standing to reach the bathroom took 2 minutes and a wall to lean on. There was no version of this weekend where I could host anyone, let alone the volume my parents brought into a room without meaning to. I hung up and lay there, staring at the water glass on my nightstand, replaying the call. My father hadn't asked how the surgery went. He hadn't asked if I needed anything, hadn't asked whether 3 days of house guests was something my body could survive. He'd told me what was happening to my house as if my recovery were a scheduling detail he'd already worked around before he dialed. This wasn't new. It was just the first time it had landed directly on top of an open incision. And pain has a way of stripping the padding off old patterns until you can see the shape of them clearly for the first time. I thought about the last time he'd used a version of that phrase. 2 years earlier, when he'd wanted to store a boat trailer in my driveway for just a few weeks that turned into 5 months, and every time I raised it, he acted as though I'd invented a problem that hadn't existed before I mentioned it. I thought about my mother hosting a birthday dinner at my apartment before I'd finished unpacking, inviting people I hadn't met yet, introducing my own home to me as though she were the one giving the tour. Each time, my discomfort had been treated as the actual disruption, not whatever they'd done to cause it. I thought about calling him back to argue, laying out reasons the way I always used to, watching the conversation go in circles until I ran out of energy and he ran out of patience, and somehow the outcome was always the same, regardless of who technically won. Instead, I called my sister. She'd moved out at 19 and built a life 2 hours away, close enough to visit, far enough to mean it when she said she needed space. She'd spent years watching our parents treat every boundary I set as a suggestion they were free to overrule if they pushed hard enough, and she'd never quite forgiven herself for the years she'd stayed quiet about it, the years she'd told herself it was easier to let me handle things my way. When I told her what had just happened, there was a silence on the line, the kind that meant she was doing math, not deciding. "I'm coming too," she said. 3 words. No questions about whether I was overreacting. No gentle suggestion that I let it go this once for the sake of peace. Just a decision, arriving as easily as our fathers had, except this one was actually going to help me. "You don't have to drive 2 hours for this," I said, already knowing she would anyway. "I know I don't have to," she said. "I'm doing it because somebody in this family should show up for you the way they expect you to show up for them." I told her where the spare key was, the one I'd mailed her the week I came home from the hospital, back when I'd first started to suspect I might need a witness who wasn't medicated and half asleep. I hadn't told her why I'd sent it. I'd just said it felt like a good idea to have someone with a key who lived far enough away not to be a daily presence, but close enough to reach me in an emergency. She'd taken it without asking questions then. Now I understood that some part of me had been preparing for exactly this kind of weekend for longer than I'd admitted to myself. She said she'd leave within the hour and be there well before Saturday morning. I believed her. My sister had never once told me she'd do something and then failed to follow through, which was such a low bar to clear that it embarrassed me to notice how much it meant. After we hung up, I lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the house settle around me, thinking about how strange it was that the 2 people who'd raised me had spent 30-some years teaching me that love came with conditions and access came with entitlement, while the person who'd grown up in the exact same house had somehow learned the opposite lesson. I didn't understand it. I was grateful for it anyway. Sleep came in short, interrupted stretches, the kind where the pain medication does just enough to blur the edges without actually letting you rest. Every time I woke, I checked my phone, half expecting another call from my father, another version of the same sentence delivered with slightly more irritation each time. It never came. He'd said what he needed to say and moved on to packing, confident that Saturday would resolve itself the way it always had before, with me making room because making room was what I did. I thought about that confidence for a long time in the dark. It wasn't malice, exactly. I didn't think my father lay awake plotting ways to disregard me. It was simpler and somehow worse than that. He'd simply never had to develop a muscle of imagining that I might say no and mean it, because I never had, not really, not in any way that stuck. Every boundary I'd ever tried to set had eventually softened under enough pressure, enough guilt, enough exhausted resignation on my part. He wasn't overriding a boundary this weekend. As far as he knew, there wasn't one to override. There was just me being difficult again, in a way that would sort itself out once he showed up in person, and I remembered how these things worked between us. I fell asleep somewhere around 3 in the morning, still holding my phone, and dreamed about a door that wouldn't stay shut no matter how many times I closed it. I woke to a text from my sister. "Almost there. Everything's going to be fine." I read it 4 times before I believed it applied to me. I heard the SUV before I saw it, tires slow on the gravel, then my mother's laugh drifting up through the open window, already too bright for a house she hadn't been invited into. I was propped up in bed with the doorbell camera open on my phone, because standing at the window to actually watch wasn't something my body would forgive me for yet. My father climbed out first, stretching like a man arriving somewhere he owned. He circled to the trunk trunk, popped it, and started pulling out the first of what looked like several bags before he'd even glanced at the house. Then he saw her. My sister was standing on the porch, arms loose at her sides, the spare key already in her hand like she'd been expecting to need it. She'd gotten there 2 hours earlier than she'd told me, which meant she'd probably left the moment we hung up the night before and just driven straight through, sleeping in her car somewhere off the highway rather than risk arriving too late. She didn't say anything yet. She didn't have to. Her presence alone rearranged the entire morning, the way a single unexpected variable can make an equation refuse to balance no matter how many times you run the numbers. My mother stopped mid-step, one hand still on the open car door, a canvas bag sliding half off her shoulder. For a second, neither of them moved, like the porch had changed shape in front of them, and they were recalculating the distance between where they stood and where they'd expected to be standing by now. "What are you doing here?" my father asked, recovering his voice faster than his expression did. "Staying with my sister," she said. "Since the surgery." She asked me. "She didn't ask you." "This is a family matter," he said, the same phrase he used whenever a conversation threatened to have witnesses who wouldn't automatically side with him. It was supposed to end things. It always had before, in every argument I could remember, the phrase functioning less like an argument and more like a door closing. "So is letting your daughter recover in peace," my sister said. "That's a family matter too. You just weren't planning on this version of it." My mother found her footing again, lifting the canvas bag like it was a peace offering with a receipt attached. "We brought food. We're here to help her. Is that a crime now, wanting to help your own daughter?" My sister glanced past her at the beach chairs strapped to the roof rack, the cooler wedged behind the back seat, the overnight bags stacked 3 deep in the trunk, enough luggage for a week rather than the 3 days my father had announced. None of it looked like help. It looked like a trip that had simply relocated to my address because the original plan hadn't included asking whether I'd survive hosting it. "That's not what help looks like," my sister said, quiet enough that it didn't sound like an accusation, only a fact she was reading off the evidence in front of her. "Help doesn't come with beach chairs." My father's jaw tightened. I watched it happen through the grainy angle of the camera, that particular shift where his face moved from confusion toward the specific kind of anger he reserved for moments when something wasn't going the way he'd assumed it would. He wasn't used to being contradicted by someone who wasn't me, someone who hadn't spent 30 years learning to soften every disagreement into something he could absorb without feeling accused. "You don't live here," he said to my sister. "This isn't your call to make. It's not yours either," she said. "It's hers, and she already made it. You just didn't like the answer, so you drove here anyway." I pressed the intercom button from upstairs, my thumb steadier than I expected it to be, given how badly the rest of me was shaking. "You're not coming in," I said, my voice carrying down through the small speaker by the door with more clarity than I felt. "Not this weekend." Static, then silence from the driveway. Through the camera, I watched my father's face do something I didn't have a name for yet, some collapse behind the eyes that his usual smile couldn't quite paper over in time. He looked at the door. He looked at my sister, still not moving from where she stood. He looked finally up at the camera above the frame, as if he could argue with the lens the way he'd always argued with me. "Chloe," he said, using the tone he used when he wanted a room to remember he was the reasonable one. "You're not thinking clearly. You just had surgery. Let us in so we can talk about this properly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," I said. "That's the actual problem here." My mother set the canvas bag down on the porch step, slowly, like she was trying to demonstrate patience she didn't feel. "We drove 3 hours," she said. "We're not just going to turn around. You can turn around, or you can stand in the driveway," my sister said. "Those are the 2 options that exist right now." For a long moment, nobody moved. My father looked at the door, then at the windows, then at his phone, as if some solution might arrive by notification if he waited long enough. My mother looked at my sister with an expression I recognized from childhood, the specific disappointment she reserved for anyone who refused to play the role she'd assigned them. And my sister had clearly been assigned the role of ally, someone who would eventually side with the family line even if it took her a minute to get there. "This is ridiculous," my father finally said, but the heat had gone out of it. He turned back toward the car, and for a second I thought that would be the whole story, that the weekend would end exactly the way it had started, with my father recalculating in real time and finding a version of retreat that let him keep his dignity. "Fine," he said over his shoulder, already reaching for the first suitcase to load back into the trunk. "We'll go to a hotel, since apparently that's easier for everyone than being reasonable." My mother hesitated on the porch, looking between the house and the car, some private negotiation happening behind her eyes about which version of this story she wanted to carry forward. Then she picked the canvas bag back up and followed him, murmuring something I couldn't catch through the camera's microphone, the tone somewhere between apology and complaint. My sister stayed on the porch until the SUV had backed all the way down the driveway and turned onto the street, luggage still visible through the rear window, beach chairs still strapped uselessly to the roof. Only then did she come inside, locking the door behind her, and climb the stairs to find me exactly where I'd been the entire time, propped against pillows, phone still open to the camera feed, watching the empty driveway like it might still produce a trick I hadn't accounted for. "You okay?" she asked, sitting carefully on the edge of the bed so she wouldn't jostle anything. "I don't know," I said honestly. "That felt too easy." "It wasn't easy," she said. "It just looked easy from up here. You should have seen his face when he saw me standing there." I laughed, which pulled at the incision in a way that made me wince, and she reached over without being asked and adjusted the pillow behind my back the way a nurse might, the way someone does when they've clearly been paying closer attention than they've let on. "Thank you for coming," I said. "Don't thank me," she said. "This is the least complicated thing I've done all year." We sat there for a while in the quiet the house had gotten back, the kind of quiet that feels different after it's been threatened, richer somehow, more deliberately chosen. chosen. I let myself believe for the length of that afternoon that the story was over, that my father had tried something, been met with a wall he hadn't expected, and retreated the way people do when a bluff gets called. I let myself believe it because believing it was easier than the alternative, and because for a few hours, nothing happened to contradict it. It wasn't until that evening, while my sister was in the kitchen making something simple for dinner, that I noticed the folder. She called my name from downstairs, and something in her voice made me forget the pain long enough to swing my legs over the side of the bed and reach for the walker my doctor had insisted I keep within arm's reach at all times. "Don't get up," she called, already halfway up the stairs. "I'm coming to you." She appeared in the doorway, holding a manila folder, the kind my father used for anything he considered official, thick with the specific weight of documents rather than a stray page or two. I recognized it immediately, not because I knew what was inside, but because I'd seen that exact folder before, years earlier, when he'd used one just like it to organize the paperwork for a used car he'd talked me into co-signing for when I was 22, a decision that had taken me 3 years and a damaged credit score to fully recover from. "It was under the porch cushion," she said. I went out to grab the mail, and there it was, wedged between the cushion and the frame like someone had tucked it there in a hurry. "Under the cushion where he sat?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "Where he was pretending to fix his shoe," she said. "I thought it was weird at the time. He crouched down by the porch chair for like 10 seconds while Mom was arguing with you through the door, and I figured he'd dropped something. I didn't think about it again until I went out just now." I asked her to bring it to me, and she did, sitting beside me on the bed while I opened it with hands that weren't entirely steady, though I told myself that was just the medication and not the specific dread building in my chest. The first page was a printed email chain, dated 3 weeks earlier, between my father and a private lender I didn't recognize the correspondence with. The subject line read, "Coastal Property, Financing Options." I scanned the first few lines, then read them again more slowly, because the words weren't arranging themselves into anything I could make sense of on the first pass. My father had written, "We're moving forward with using the beach property as collateral. My daughter is fully on board, just finalizing some details on her end." I looked up at my sister. "What beach property?" I said, though it wasn't really a question, because there was only one property that description could apply to, and it was the one I was currently lying inside of, 3 days out from surgery, having just spent the morning locking my own parents out of it. "Keep reading," she said, her voice careful in a way that told me she'd already read further than I had. The next several pages were financial documents, the kind with letterhead and reference numbers describing a loan application for something called an equity line, using my house as security. My name appeared throughout, printed cleanly beside blanks meant for a signature, blanks that were, as far as I could tell from the scan quality, still blank. But further into the folder there was another version of the same document, and this one wasn't blank. This one had a signature on it, my name, in handwriting that was close enough to convincing that for one disorienting second I actually doubted myself, actually wondered whether I'd signed something during a haze of post-surgical medication that I simply didn't remember. "That's not your signature," my sister said, watching my face. "I know your signature. That's not it." She was right, and once she said it out loud I could see it too, could see the small differences that separated a forgery from the real thing, the way the loop on the C curved slightly wrong, the way the pressure changed inconsistently across letters that should have flowed together if a single hand had written them at a single moment. "When was this dated?" I asked, though my eyes had already found the date at the bottom of the page. 6 days earlier, the day before my surgery. "He had this ready before you even went under anesthesia," my sister said, and I heard something shift in her voice, something moving from concern into a colder register I hadn't heard from her before, not toward our parents, not in all the years I'd known her. "This wasn't a plan he came up with because you said no to a beach trip. This was already in motion. The beach trip request was never really about a beach trip." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the pieces rearrange themselves into a shape I didn't want to look at directly. The call about the house, my refusal, my mother's insistence that the plans weren't changing, delivered with a flatness that made more sense now, less like stubbornness, and more like someone protecting a schedule that had already been set in motion for reasons that had nothing to do with sand and sunscreen. "He wasn't trying to throw a party in my house," I said slowly. "He needed to be inside it, physically inside it, for something. Or he needed you gone from it," my sister said, which is worse because it means the surgery might have been convenient for him instead of just bad timing. I didn't want to consider that possibility, and I told her so, and she nodded and didn't push it, but I noticed she didn't disagree either. We sat there together with the folder open between us, the quiet from earlier in the day gone completely, replaced by something that made the whole house feel different, less like a place I'd successfully defended, and more like a place that had already been compromised in ways I hadn't detected yet. "We need to know more about this lender," I said. "I already looked him up while I was making dinner," she said, pulling out her phone. "He's a private lender, does business loans, some real estate financing, the kind of guy who doesn't ask a lot of questions if the paperwork looks clean enough on the surface. And Dad's been talking to him for 3 weeks, at least 3 weeks. That's just when this email chain starts. There could be more before that we don't have." I thought about the boat trailer that stayed in my driveway for 5 months. I thought about every small overreach I'd absorbed over the years, because raising an objection always cost more than it seemed worth at the time. None of those had ever involved forged signatures or private lenders or documents timed to arrive the day before surgery. This was a different category of thing entirely, and some part of me was still trying to find a version of events where it wasn't, where there was an explanation that made this merely careless rather than deliberate. "I don't think this is a misunderstanding," my sister said, watching me search for one anyway. "I think you should stop looking for a way to make this smaller than it is." She was right, and I knew she was right, and I still spent the rest of that evening turning the the pages over in my hands, looking for an angle that would let my father be merely thoughtless instead of something worse, and finding every time that the paper trail didn't offer me that mercy. My sister called our father that night on speaker, sitting beside my bed so I could hear every word without having to hold anything or lean toward a screen. He picked up on the second ring, his voice already carrying the particular warmth he used when he wanted to sound like the reasonable party in any conversation. "I'm glad you're calling," he said. "Maybe now we can talk about this like adults." "We found the folder," my sister said. No preamble, no softening. "The one you left under the porch cushion." The silence that followed lasted just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know, though he recovered fast, faster than I expected given what we were holding. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said. "The private lender you've been emailing," my sister said. "Coastal property financing options. Ring any bells?" Another pause, shorter this time. "That's a private business matter that has nothing to do with either of you." "It has my sister's name on it," she said. "It has her signature on it, except it isn't her signature, which means somebody put it there. You're misunderstanding some paperwork," he said, and I could hear the shift in him, the pivot from denial toward damage control, a move I recognized because I'd watched him make it my entire life whenever a lie stopped being sustainable and needed to become a misunderstanding instead. "I was exploring some options in case Chloe ever wanted help with renovations. Nothing was finalized. There's a signed version," I said, speaking for the first time, my voice steadier than I expected. "Dated the day before my surgery." "You signed things during your recovery you don't remember," he said quickly. "The medication." "I never saw this document before tonight," I said, "and you know that because you're the one who forged it." "That's a serious accusation," he said, and something in his tone had gone cold now, the warmth entirely gone, replaced by the particular sharpness he used when he felt cornered rather than merely inconvenienced. "It's a serious document," my sister said. "Where's Mom? Put her on." There was a muffled sound, a hand over the receiver, voices too low to make out clearly. When my mother's voice came through, it had none of its usual certainty. "Girls, please," she said. "Your father has worked so hard. This loan, it's not what you think. It's meant to help all of us. There were going to be renovations, a whole plan." "Did you know he signed my name?" I said. The silence this time was longer, and it told me everything her words hadn't. "I thought you'd agreed," she finally said. "He told me you'd agreed weeks ago before the surgery. I didn't think to ask for proof. I never think to ask him for proof." "So you knew about the loan," my sister said. "Even if you thought I'd agreed to it." "I knew there was a plan," my mother said. "I didn't know the details. I try not to know the details most of the time. It's easier that way." That single sentence told me more about the architecture of my parents' marriage than a decade of holidays had. My mother had built an entire life around not knowing the details, a kind of willful blindness that let her show up to family events feeling innocent of things she'd absorbed just enough of to benefit from. "Where's the money supposed to go?" I asked. "If the loan closed, where does it go?" Another pause, and this one had my father's voice returning to answer it, sharper now, less patient. "That's not something either of you need to worry about. This is being handled." "Being handled," I repeated. "By who?" "By me," he said. "The way things in this family have always been handled. You'll thank me eventually, once you see what this actually accomplishes." "I want to know if the loan has already closed," my sister said. "Yes or no?" He didn't answer that directly, which was itself an answer. The specific silence of someone calculating how much truth he could afford to release into a conversation he no longer fully controlled. "We're going to find out either way," my sister said. "You can tell us now, or we can find out from the lender directly, which I promise you is going to go worse for you than just telling us." "Don't you dare contact him," my father said, and for the first time all night his voice cracked slightly, just enough to reveal something underneath the composure, something closer to fear than anger. "You have no idea what you'd be interfering with." "Then explain it," I said. "Actually, explain it. Not handle it, not thank you later. Actually tell us what's happening to my house." He didn't. He said he needed to go, that we were being hysterical, that this conversation wasn't productive, and then the line went dead before either of us could respond, leaving my sister and I sitting in the quiet of my bedroom with a phone that had gone silent, and a folder full of documents that suddenly felt heavier than they had an hour earlier. "He didn't deny the loan closed," my sister said slowly. "He just refused to say either way." "Which means it probably has," I said. "Which means we need to find out exactly what that means for you," she said, already reaching for her laptop. "Tonight, if we can manage it. Because if this thing is already in motion, every day we wait is a day it keeps moving without us." My sister spent the next hour on her laptop while I lay propped against the pillows, trying to keep my breathing steady, the kind of steady that has nothing to do with calm and everything to do with not wanting to need more medication before we'd figured out what we were actually dealing with. "The lending company is registered," she said, scrolling through something I couldn't see from my angle. "It's a real company, small, does private loans mostly for real estate. Legitimate on paper, which is somehow worse because it means this isn't some scam artist Dad got tangled up with. It means Dad went looking for exactly this kind of lender, one who does asset-backed loans without asking too many questions about ownership history. Can you find anything about whether the loan closed?" "Not from here," she said. "That's not public, but look at this." She turned the screen toward me. It was a property record search, the kind of site that pulls public filings, and there, dated 4 days earlier, was a lien notation against my house. Not a full transfer, not anything that had actually changed ownership, but a formal filing that meant someone had used the property as collateral for something, and that whatever it was had already progressed far enough to leave a mark in the public record. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the medication. "That's real," I said. "That's not a draft. That's not paperwork that might happen. That's already happened." "It means the loan closed," my sister said. "Or it's far enough along wrong that a lien got filed in anticipation of it closing. Either way, this isn't hypothetical anymore. Somebody borrowed against your house using a forged signature, and the county has a record of it. I thought about my father's voice on the phone an hour earlier, the crack in his composure when my sister mentioned contacting the lender directly. That hadn't been the reaction of a man worried about an embarrassing misunderstanding. That had been the reaction of a man who understood exactly how much trouble he was in and was trying to buy time before anyone else understood it too. Why would he need money this badly? I said, mostly to myself, though my sister answered anyway. I don't know yet, but people who forge documents to borrow against property they don't own aren't usually doing it for fun. Something's pushing him. We sat with that for a while, the laptop glowing between us, the lien filing sitting there in black and white with my address printed clearly at the top, a piece of information that felt like it belonged to someone else's life, some cautionary story I'd have read about and felt sorry for a stranger over. I want to call the lending company, I said eventually. Not Dad, them, directly. It's almost 10 at night, my sister said. I don't care. I want to know what they think they have on file. I want to know whose name is actually on whatever they think closed. She found a number for the lending company easily enough. A small office listed with a local address 40 minutes from my house, the kind of operation that probably ran on a skeleton staff and didn't expect calls after business hours. We tried it anyway. It went to a voicemail box that hadn't been personalized beyond a generic greeting, and I left a message that I hoped sounded calmer than I felt, explaining who I was, explaining that I believed my signature had been forged on a loan application using my property as collateral, asking someone to call me back as soon as possible. That might not go anywhere until Monday, my sister said, once I'd hung up. Then we use the weekend, I said. We find out everything we can on our own, so that by the time somebody from that office actually calls us back, we already know more than they're expecting us to. She nodded, already pulling the folder back toward her, spreading the pages out across the blanket so we could look at everything together instead of piecemeal, the email chain, the blank application, the forged signature, the property lien, laid out like evidence, because that's exactly what it was. There's a notary stamp on the signed version, my sister said, pointing to a small embossed seal near the bottom of the page, one I hadn't noticed on my first read-through, my attention having been entirely consumed by the signature itself. A real notary would have had to witness that signature being applied, which means either the notary is in on this, or he never actually appeared in front of one, I finished, which means the stamp is fake too. Or the notary stamped something without properly verifying who was signing it, she said, which happens more than people think. Rushed notaries, people who don't check ID carefully enough, especially if the person requesting the stamp seems confident and the paperwork looks official. I looked at the seal more closely, the raised lettering catching the lamplight at an angle, a small circular imprint that was supposed to mean something certain and now meant nothing certain at all. We need to find out who this notary is, I said. If they'll tell us the truth about what they actually witnessed, that's not just us saying the signature looks wrong. That's someone with a professional license confirming it. That's the difference between an accusation and evidence, my sister said. I'll start looking for the notary's information first thing tomorrow. Tonight, you should sleep. You look like you're about to fall over, and I don't mean that as an insult. She was right, and I hated that she was right, because some part of me wanted to keep pulling at every thread until the entire shape of what my father had done was fully visible, laid out clean and undeniable in front of us. But my body had limits. My determination didn't share, and the incision along my spine had started to ache in a way that meant the medication was wearing thin and another dose was overdue. I let her help me settle back against the pillows, let her turn off the lamp and lay awake for a long time in the dark anyway, thinking about lien filings and notary stamps and my father's voice cracking on the phone, wondering how deep this actually went and whether the version of him I'd known my whole life had ever really existed, or whether I'd simply never had a reason serious enough to look underneath it before now. There was a business card clipped to the inside of the folder, something I'd missed on my first pass through the documents, tucked behind the lien filing where it was easy to overlook. Mobile notary services, a phone number, and an email address printed beneath a small logo. My sister called the number by 9 the next morning and, remarkably, got the notary to pick up on the second try. She put the call on speaker so we could both hear, and I listened as my sister explained the situation carefully, factually, without accusation, simply asking whether the notary recalled notarizing a document for a coastal property loan application roughly a week earlier. There was a pause on the line, then the sound of someone flipping through what I assumed was an appointment log. I remember that one, the notary finally said. It was unusual. The man who called me in said his daughter would be present to sign, that she was recovering from a procedure and couldn't come to my office, so I'd need to do a mobile visit. Did she sign in front of you? My sister asked. No, the notary said, and something in her voice had gone careful, the tone of someone realizing mid-sentence that she might be describing a mistake. When I arrived, he told me she was asleep, resting after her surgery, and that she'd already signed earlier that day before the medication made her drowsy. He showed me the signed page and asked me to notarize it based on his confirmation that he'd witnessed her sign it himself since I hadn't been able to observe it directly. And you did that, I said, unable to stay quiet any longer. You stamped a document without seeing me sign it. I shouldn't have, the notary said, and I heard real distress creep into her voice now, the recognition landing all at once. I know I shouldn't have. He was very convincing, and the situation seemed plausible given the circumstances he described, and I've been doing this for 11 years without an issue, so I didn't think to question it as carefully as I should have. But no, I never witnessed a signature. I stamped based entirely on his word. The confirmation didn't feel like relief the way I'd expected it to. It felt like the floor dropping away entirely, the last thin membrane between suspicion and certainty tearing open all at once. My father hadn't just forged a signature, he'd manipulated a licensed professional into legitimizing that forgery, using my surgery, my actual physical vulnerability, as the cover story that made the whole scheme plausible enough for someone to go along with it. I need that in writing, my sister said, her voice steady, even though I could see her hands weren't. A statement, whatever you're comfortable providing, confirming you never witnessed the signature. I'll send something today, the notary said. I want to be clear. I take this seriously. If a document was falsified using my seal, that's something I need to report as well, on my end, to protect my license and make sure this doesn't happen through me again. We thanked her and hung up, and I sat there for a long moment absorbing what we'd just confirmed, the shape of it settling into something I could no longer explain away as a misunderstanding or overreach or any of the smaller words I'd been reaching for over the past 2 days. My phone rang 20 minutes later, an unfamiliar number, a local area code. My sister answered it on speaker at my nod. "This is the lender, returning a call about a property loan," the voice said, brisk, businesslike, clearly a man who dealt with sensitive calls often enough to have a practiced neutrality ready for whatever came next. "I believe my signature was forged on a loan application you processed," I said, using my house as collateral. There was a pause, the sound of someone pulling up a file. "I have the file here. Closed 4 days ago. $80,000 disbursed to the borrower's account the same day." Another pause, longer this time. "You're saying you didn't sign this?" "I've never seen this document before 3 days ago," I said. "The notary who stamped it just confirmed to us she never witnessed me sign anything. She stamped it based on my father's word alone." The silence on the line this time was different, weightier, the sound of a man recalculating his own exposure in real time. "If that's accurate, this loan was closed on fraudulent documentation," he said slowly. "That's a significant problem. For you, obviously, but also for my company. If we processed something that didn't meet verification standards." "Where did the $80,000 go?" my sister asked. "I can tell you it went to an account associated with the borrower," the lender said. "I'd need to review the specifics before I share account details, given the situation. But I want to be direct with you both. If this loan closed on a forged signature, it needs to be unwound immediately, and I'll be initiating that process on my end today. I'll also need everything you have, the notary statement, whatever else you've gathered, because at this point, protecting my own licensing is now part of my priority here too." "Why did he need $80,000? I asked, mostly to myself, though the lender answered anyway. "I don't discuss a borrower's stated purpose with a third party," he said, "but I can tell you the application described the funds as being needed urgently, within days, for what he characterized as a time-sensitive business obligation. That's typically language people use when they're behind on something they can't afford to be behind on any longer." I thought about the boat trailer, the birthday party thrown in an apartment I hadn't finished unpacking, 30 years of small overreaches that had never once involved a number this large, this urgent, this willing to use my recovering body as camouflage. Whatever my father owed, whoever he owed it to, he'd been desperate enough to forge his own daughter's signature and manipulate a notary rather than find another way through it. Desperate enough that a beach trip request delivered with total confidence 3 days after major surgery had actually been a cover story for accessing a house he needed empty and unwatched just long enough to make sure nobody stopped him from claiming it as something he could borrow against. He hadn't come to my house to disrupt my recovery. My recovery had been the opportunity. The surgery itself, my body being weak enough that saying no wouldn't matter, had been the reason this worked at all, or should have, if my sister hadn't shown up on that porch before he finished whatever he still needed to do inside those walls. My father called again that afternoon, and this time my sister let it ring twice before answering, putting it on speaker without a word. "The lender called me," he said, no greeting, his voice stripped of the warmth he'd used on every previous call, replaced by something flatter, something closer to panic held very tightly in place. "He says the loan's getting unwound. He says there's a fraud complaint. Do you understand what you've done?" "I didn't do anything," I said. "I found out what you did. I needed that money," he said, and for the first time since Friday, he sounded like he was telling the truth without calculating how it would land first. "It wasn't for nothing. It wasn't some scheme. I was going to pay it back before you even noticed the lien. I had a plan. You forged my signature," I said. "You had a notary lie for you. You used my surgery as the reason nobody would check carefully enough. None of that is a plan. That's just what you did to me, dressed up as a plan. You don't understand the position I was in," he said. "I don't need to understand it," I said. "You could have told me. Any version of the truth would have been better than this. You chose this instead, because it was easier than actually asking me for help and hearing me say no." He didn't answer that, and the silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Then my mother's voice came through, quieter than his had been, stripped of the deflection she'd used 2 nights earlier. "I should have asked more questions," she said. "I told myself not knowing meant I wasn't part of it. I don't believe that anymore." "You don't have to decide what you believe right now," I said, and I meant it, because I didn't have the energy left to referee whatever reckoning she was having with herself 3 days out from surgery, holding a folder full of evidence against the man she'd built 40 years with. My father's voice came back, lower now, the panic underneath finally breaking through whatever composure he'd been rationing it with. "If this goes to the police, if the lender presses this as fraud, I could lose everything. My license, maybe worse. Is that actually what you want?" I thought about the question for a long moment, aware that whatever I said next wasn't going to be the ending of anything. Not really. Just the next thing that happened after all the other things. The way real life moves instead of the way stories are supposed to close. "I want the loan unwound," I said. "I want my name off every document with your handwriting pretending to be mine. Whatever happens happens to you after that isn't something I'm deciding. You already decided it the day you sat on my porch pretending to fix your shoe while you hid that folder from your own daughter. Nobody said anything for a while. I could hear my father breathing on the other end, uneven, the sound of a man realizing that the version of this conversation where I forgave him quickly, the way I always had, wasn't the version that was actually happening. Chloe, he finally said, my name landing differently than it had all weekend, no performance left inside it. I don't know what to say to fix this. I know, I said. That's the part I needed you to understand. I reached over and ended the call myself, my thumb finding the red circle before either of them could say anything else, and set the phone face down on the blanket beside me. My sister didn't say anything either, just reached over and took my hand, the folder still open on the bed between us, the lean filing and the forged signature, and the notary's careful, damning statement all sitting there in the afternoon light, evidence of exactly what it had taken to make me finally stop making room.